Now let me talk about 21st century conflict and what you can expect from the environment that we're going to see. As we've looked at this, sometimes I have to remind civilian audiences that we are at war. And I said that we've been at war for 7.5 years. You go around the United States a lot and you don't necessarily get that same feeling. But our armed forces and the Army have been, the Army's been the leader in this war for the last 7 years. This war is against the global extremist terrorist network that attacked us on our soil, and that is led by brutal and ruthless men who are not going to quit, they're not going to give up, they're not going to go away. This is a long-term ideological struggle. And the interesting thing is that we, the military, can only take that struggle. Because for this ideological struggle to be brought to completion, the real struggle has to take place within Islam, modern and extremist Islam. And you're starting to see the beginnings of that out of our province in Iraq, where the local Sunni turned against the Sunni extremists. It is a first step in the beginning of the end of the war on terror, but it is a step that has to be taken through the rest of Iraq and then through Afghanistan and the other countries in the area. I think we're well on our way to accomplishing our objectives in Iraq, and we will be well on our way to accomplishing our objectives in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan is a much longer term problem. Iraq is a decade problem. Afghanistan, because this level of development, is a 2 or 3 decade problem. And that's just the rest of Iraq. But the prosperity was very unevenly distributed. And I've seen estimates that said by 2020, 2.5 billion people in the world will live below the poverty line. So what you see with globalization, yes, prosperity, but have and have nots. And if you look at where the prosperity is and isn't, you look at South America, Africa, parts of the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, you see economic conditions that can be exploited by extremists for their own benefit. Technology. Technology is another double-edged sword. The same technology that can bring knowledge to anyone with a computer and a hookup is being used by terrorists to export terror around the globe. Demographics. Demographics are also going in the wrong direction. I've seen estimates that say that the populations of some of these developing countries will double by 2020. Can you imagine the population of Pakistan doubling in a decade? And the problems that would bring to a government already stressed. The other part about demographics, people move to cities. By 2030, estimates are that 60% of the world's population will live in cities. That says an awful lot about whole world poverty. And lastly, your demographics, the middle-class populations of India and China are larger than the population of the United States. That's a lot of 2-car families. And you can imagine what that would mean for competition for all these stations. 2 things that worry me most on the trends: weapons of mass destruction, enhanced terrorists, and safe havens. Countries or parts of countries where the local governments can't or won't deny their territory to terrorists. Much like you saw in Afghanistan before September 11, and what you're seeing today on the Somali coast, where those pirates are moving out of Bill to hijack the ships. On the weapons of mass destruction, there's over 1,200 known terrorist groups around the world. The bulk of them are seeking weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt in my mind that they will be successful in attaining one in the next 5 years. And when they do, they will attempt to use it against the developed country. There's no doubt. I was in Iraq for a long time. I read this stuff. That's what they'll try to do. So if you look at the fact we're at war, long-term ideological struggle, and those trends, some trends push me in the wrong way. And what I see is the next decade or so is one of what I call persistent knowledge. Protracted confrontation among state, non-state, and individual actors who are increasingly willing to use violence to achieve their ideological objective. What happened in Mumbai is good to know. And a terrorist organization from Pakistan attacked the commercial center of one of the 5th largest economies in the world. Didn't involve us, doesn't have to. But they were using that attack to accomplish their political and ideological objectives. I think we're going to see and have to do a lot more. Now, it's not enough for us in the military to say, okay, we're going to be doing a lot of stuff like this in the future. We have to look at the character of the conflict. What does war in the 21st century look like? And you can look at Iraq and you can look at Afghanistan, and those are models for doing so. But I think what's more interesting is to look at what happened in Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Where a small number, I've seen 500, I've seen 3,000, but a relatively small number of Hezbollah operatives held off an attacking Israeli armored force backed up by a fairly significant air effort and attack helicopters and artillery. And basically fought them to the ground. How did they do it? First of all, Hezbollah is a non-state actor. It's a terrorist organization. It was operating within a state, Lebanon. It was supported by 2 other states, Syria and Iran. And it was fighting a 4th state, Israel. They began the war with 13,000 missiles and rockets. And not the small rockets that they fired at our FOBs in Iraq and Afghanistan, but 220 missiles that they fired at Israeli population centers. They used unmanned aerial vehicles to target the Israeli forces. They shot down an Israeli helicopter with a surface-to-air missile, state-of-the-art. They used improvised explosive devices to channelize attacking Israeli armored forces into kill zones where they fired at them with state-of-the-art anti-tank missiles. They hit an Israeli corvette, a ship. Crazy people in the car. In the Persian Gulf. I'm sorry, the Mediterranean Sea. They used secure cell phones to communicate with command and control. And they used the local media to get their word out. The instruments of power are no longer in the hands of states. And that's a fundamentally different challenge for us. And as we look at that, and you're thinking about it, I can see your brain's working here, what the heck would I do in a situation like that? You see a much more complex situation. Now I was struck, I was looking back through some things that I can, we have these debates around town about whether it's the nature of war or it's the character of war. And what we finally came down to is, look, the nature of war is about what it is. The nature of war doesn't really change, but the character of conflict has evolved over time. And I was thinking through the first 3 sentences with infantry in battle. This is a book put together by George Marshall, the head of the Infantry Center, in 1934, right after World War I. It's a series of World War I vignettes on leadership. And what he wrote about war at that time is as relevant then as it is now. He said the art of war has no traffic with rules, where the infinitely varied circumstances and conditions of combat never produce exactly the same situation twice. Mission, terrain, weather, dispositions, armament, morale, supply, and comparative strength are variables whose mutations always combine to form a new tactical pattern. Thus, in battle, each situation is unique and must be solved on its own merits. And that's where leadership comes in. Because it falls on the shoulders of our leaders to lead the men and women of our Army in these very difficult, very complex situations.